Right, so how can we go about limiting the consequences of rejection? How do we avoid rejection? First of all, we talked about this morning, select the right target journal for your research, the right audience, the right aim and scope, the right amount of novelty and urgency in your work. Provide a clear message. Write the paper logically and clearly. Nicole talked about that in the previous talk. Logical flow is very important because then there's very little to criticize about. Make sure that your work is not just incremental, but really novel and a contribution to the field of research that you're working in. Provide adequate backup, experimental evidence of your conclusions. Right? Make sure that the results underscore the conclusions. Make sure that your literature review is up to date. I recently facilitated a large open online open course on academic writing, and one of the lessons was about the literature review. And many students asked me, so how do you go about writing a literature review, and how far back in time do you have to go? In many universities, supervisors, particularly at undergraduate level, supervisors say, only consider papers in the last 5 years. I think that is a very artificial deadline. It depends completely on your field. Right? Some fields may not be very active. There might not be many papers in the last 5 years, so you may have to go back further. Or you may have to go broader, not just focusing on your own subject area, but slightly adjacent areas as well. I think in terms of writing a good literature review, is you need to be as comprehensive as you can be, but not necessarily only focused on the last 5 years. You may want to go back to that seminal research paper from 1946, where the field with which the field was opened, and that was so important for the field that set the basis. That's more than 5 years ago. You start with that paper, and then of course you should focus your literature review on what happened most recently, and then place your own research into that context of what has been happening most recently. I talked about Retraction Watch earlier. There was an article on Retraction Watch just a few weeks ago where a paper was initially accepted and later it was retracted because the reviewers had actually assessed the paper and they thought it was good enough for publication. But it turned out that what these authors had done, they had invented some method. It was in mathematics, I believe. They had invented a method that had actually been invented 40 years ago under a different name, but because the field was so scattered, the reviewers were actually not aware of this, and only later did someone else find out about this. Now, a good literature review might have picked up on that, although I'm not entirely sure. Right? So the point is, make sure that your literature review is as comprehensive as possible. How do you know it's as comprehensive as possible? Read many papers, pick the important aspects of all of the papers that you read, put them together in a nice, well-written story, and at some point you will find that when you start reading more papers, you get back to the same points all the time. At that point, you're probably done with your review. You've covered all the main aspects, and you're ready to move on. Sorry, that was a long explanation of one point. Also make sure that you use proper grammar and spelling. Now, as non-native English speakers, it may well be that grammar is an issue, but spelling should never be a problem. I find it very annoying with my Chinese students when they send me a paper for final editing that is full of typos. Typos is something that you can do something about. If you work in Word, Word will actually have a little squiggly red line under a typo. You can deal with that. Grammar is okay. I mean, if English is not your first language, it's not mine either. My first language is Dutch, but I've been working and living in English for many years now. Grammar is fine. Grammatical problems, but typos are never fine. And referees and editors will actually be quite upset if you didn't take care of the typos, because that shows that you're not very careful. Right? That's the impression, at least, that the editor and reviewers will get. And that's never good for their assessment of your paper. And also, make sure that your figures are clear and appropriately labeled. Keep in mind that in a journal, a figure that shows nicely on A4 size, will be reduced in size. That means that the labels will be reduced as well. So don't make them too small to be legible. This is a funny one. Avoid rejection by not having any form of research or publication misconduct. In essence, what that means, don't manipulate your images. In biology particularly, very often what I see on the Retraction Watch website is that papers get retracted because images have been manipulated inappropriately. So just avoid any of that. Just go about and be a an honest scientist. Clearly identify your topic, hypothesis, and objectives. That's what you do in the introduction section. What works very well in my experience is that you start writing your introduction section, giving a broad overview of the field, narrowing it down to the topic that you're interested in, and then spelling out the point you want to address in your paper. That's not it though. At the end of the paper, in the discussion section, or possibly in the conclusions, you come back to that research question and you answer it as best as you can. That gives you a nice cycle and a nice closed loop of the paper. And that also will avoid being rejected based on an unclear hypothesis or objectives. Make sure your manuscript is well organized. We talked about this before. And read the author instructions. Again, I've said this a number of times. Read the instructions to authors and make sure that you comply with the guidelines. Now, rejection happens to the best of us. Here's an example of, we're almost through, by the way, of work by Hans Krebs, who discovered the citric acid cycle, for which I believe he got, did he get the Nobel Prize? I'm not entirely sure. But he submitted this in 1937 to the journal Nature, and it was rejected, and only a few months later it was published in a lesser-known journal called Enzymologia. This turned out to be a really seminal paper that is still being referred to today, but it was rejected by Nature as insignificant. Happens sometimes. Editors are humans as well, they make mistakes. Reviewers are humans, right? So don't be too down if your paper gets rejected. It might be very seminal in several decades from now. Here's another one. In 1966, the paper on Fourier transform nuclear magnetic resonance spectroscopy by Richard Ernst, who was a Nobel laureate in chemistry, was rejected twice by the Journal of Chemical Physics before it was published in the Review of Scientific Instruments. He got a Nobel Prize for this, even though his paper was rejected twice. See, there is hope. It's not all negative, right? It's not all dark. Rejection is a fact of life. It happens to all of us. And so, just deal with it. Just move on and do the best science you can. With that, I'm leaving you. Thank you very much, or I should say, terima kasih.